On November the 14th, 1887, the morning temperature in Coldwater stood at 11 degrees above zero before sunrise, and a hard rind of ice sealed the horse trough outside the station, even though winter had not yet declared itself in full. Coldwater was a railroad camp town, stretched along the Laramie line with 312 souls. 2 muddy streets, 1 church, 1 schoolhouse, and a row of plank buildings that looked stout in October light and thin as kindling when the wind found their seams. Coal smoke rose from stovepipes in narrow gray columns, and men on the depot platform argued freight timetables as if schedule and confidence were defenses against weather. They had seen blizzards, certainly, and they had survived difficult winters. Yet most had come west in years when rail service held and supply wagons arrived often enough to keep fear from becoming policy. What they possessed in Coldwater was not ignorance, but a dangerous form of optimism. The belief that last year's hardship measured next year's risk. That morning, a young widow stepped down from the eastbound car in black wool that had already gone shiny at the sleeves from wear. Her name was Earl Jennings. She was 19 years old. She carried 1 trunk bound in iron straps, a wooden box of seed potatoes wrapped in sacking, and a burial ledger from Cheyenne with her husband's name written in careful ink beside a date in late October. The pages smelled faintly of lamp soot and damp paper. She did not show it to anyone at the depot, but she kept it close against her side with the practical caution of one guarding title papers or winter medicine. Her husband, Caleb Jennings, had died during an early storm crossing east of Rawlins with a freight crew, and the body had been put in frozen ground outside Cheyenne because wagons could not move farther north in time. Coldwater had not buried him, yet Coldwater would carry his widow. Earl had not been born in Wyoming or in any American territory. She had been born on the Finnish coast of Ostrobothnia, where wind came off the Gulf with a cruelty that taught lessons faster than schoolmasters could, and where families survived long, dark seasons by trusting earth and stone more than timber walls and pride. Her mother had kept winter ledgers in a blue cloth book, with temperatures, stores consumed, failures noted, and repairs assigned before thaw. Her grandfather, a fisherman in warmer months and a cellar mason when nets were iced in, had taught her to read frost depth by the hardness of shaded soil and to measure safety not by what was visible on market shelves, but by what could be reached in darkness. In that country, root cellars were not an eccentricity. They were law written in dirt. Earl had watched old women press palms to packed earth and say that soil held near 55 degrees while sky slaughtered beasts above it. She had learned to believe them because she had seen calves stiff in drifts while potatoes stayed firm underground. By the time she reached Wyoming, those teachings were no longer family lore. They were commandment. Caleb had admired her steadiness and had promised they would build properly once wages stabilized, once spring came, once timber prices dipped, once any number of things that seemed near in August and vanished by October. Then the storm took him. What remained to Earl was grief. A trunk, a box of seed potatoes, and inherited method. She rented a narrow room for 3 nights near the station, paid 40 cents each night, and spent those days walking Coldwater's perimeter with her gloves off, despite the cold, pressing soil, watching drainage, and studying exposure. She observed homes raised quickly on shallow foundations, pantries no deeper than a man's knee, and wood stacks placed in open yards where drifting snow would lock access first. She listened in the general store while men boasted of buying extra coal, and women discussed preserving fruit, and she recognized the same pattern that had preceded deaths in her childhood district: confidence in supplies that had not yet been tested by interruption. On the 4th day, she purchased a half-collapsed dugout lot at the North Bank for $18 cash from a ranch hand eager to be rid of spring flood trouble. Townsmen called that ground worthless because thaw years sent runoff through it, and because no one with means wished to live beside a cut bank where mud pulled at boots. Worthless land had one virtue Earl required: earth depth enough to hold temperature and to hide a structure from wind. She signed her name in a clerk's ledger with a hand that did not tremble. She then paid $1.20 for a used shovel, 75 cents for a pick with a split ash handle, and $3 for a wagon load of mixed fieldstone hauled from a dry ridge 2 miles out. She bought 14 cedar posts at 12 cents apiece, 2 heavy plank doors salvaged from a dismantled freight shed at 90 cents each, and a crate of square nails for 35 cents. Every purchase went into a small notebook in figures as exacting as prayer. Silas Pemberton watched these transactions from the porch of his store and office, where he sat in broadcloth coat and polished boots that seldom touched unplanned mud. He was a large man of 40 or near it, with a trimmed beard gone silver at the chin, a vest chain bright as coin, and the posture of one accustomed to debts being paid in deference, if not in dollars. His store supplied flour, lamp oil, grain, and credit to much of Coldwater, and his ledger reached farther than the church register in practical power. He asked no direct questions at first. He laughed with men who leaned on the rail and said the widow was burying herself before she died, and laughter carried faster than mail. By week's end, he gave the project a name in front of 3 teamsters and a school trustee. He called it Jennings' Tomb. The phrase moved through pump lines, church steps, and stable aisles with the speed of winter rumor, and by the time Earl finished marking her excavation corners, some children were already chanting it from across the street before being hushed by mothers who did not fully disagree. Earl hired no one. She rose before first light, boiled oats, hitched a borrowed burro to a hand rope, and began cutting sod in blocks 3 feet long and 8 inches thick, each block lifted with a flat spade and turned grass-side, down to dry for stacking. She laid out a chamber 12 feet by 16 inside the bank, with the long axis east to west so the shortest wall faced prevailing north winds. The initial cut reached 7 feet below grade at the rear and 5 feet at the entrance trench. She tamped the floor with clay in 2-inch lifts, wetting each layer and beating it with a timber maul until it rang dull and firm. Along the interior, she set fieldstone against the earth face without mortar, then backfilled gaps with clay and chaff to reduce air movement. The labor stripped skin from her palms inside 10 days. She wrapped them in linen at night and worked again at dawn. By the last week of November, she had framed a roof with reclaimed cottonwood beams, spaced 16 inches apart, laid willow brush across them, then packed 18 inches of earth above for mast. She left a narrow smoke vent shaft and built a crude baffle from split boards so wind could not drive directly down. The entrance became her most deliberate work. She dug a short dogleg passage to prevent straight-line drafts, installed the outer plank door facing south, then set an inner door 18 inches inside it to create dead air between. Each door received a wool gasket, sewn from worn blanket strips and pegged in place with wooden dowels. She built shelving from scrap pine along the east wall, 6 tiers deep enough for crocks and jars, and dug a shallow sump in the rear corner with a gravel bed to catch seep in thaw months. It was not elegant. It was exact. Neighbors slowed to stare as they passed. Some shook heads. Some muttered pity. A few offered brief, practical help, then withdrew when talk hardened against her. No committee came. No churchwomen called with bread after the first week. Earl continued with the patience of one carrying out instruction already paid for by the dead. When she paused at dusk, she stood at the cut bank with earth on her skirt and measured shadows for frosthold. Coldwater still looked prosperous in lamplight. Shelves were full. Credit was easy. The rail still ran. Yet on that north bank, under a low roof of sod and stone, the first true winter house in town was taking shape, while the town that mocked it remained above ground, confident in timber and habit. On December the 2nd, 1887, the temperature fell to 19 below zero by midnight, and a north wind drove fine snow across Coldwater in long, low sheets that erased wagon ruts within an hour and packed the gaps between board walls until doors stuck in their frames. Lamps burned late along Main Street, not for comfort but for checking stoves, hauling extra coal scuttles, and listening to roofs complain under gusts that sounded like freight brakes taken hard on icy rails. It was the first true test of that winter, brief compared with what would come in later years, yet severe enough to expose every careless seam in town. By dawn, 2 chicken coops had collapsed, 1 smoke flue had cracked, and the schoolhouse entry drift stood shoulder high against the steps. Earl Jennings spent that night below grade with her back against stone, and a thermometer hung from a nail in the center beam. Outside, the mercury plunged and the wind struck the bank until loose sod hissed like thrown sand. Inside, the needle held between 49 and 53 degrees, shifting only when she opened the inner door to feed her stove. She had set 1 small cast-iron box stove on brick feet, left a 6-inch clearance from rear wall stone, and ran stovepipe through a collar packed with clay and wool, so heat did not leak around the metal throat. The chamber smelled of damp earth, pine boards, and iron warmed slowly. Her water crock did not freeze. Her potatoes did not blacken. At first light, she climbed the dogleg passage, pushed open the outer door against packed drift, and saw men in the street beating ice from pump handles with hammerheads. Silas Pemberton stood on his porch later that morning in a fur-collared coat, issuing coal notes to 3 ranch hands while his clerk weighed flour behind frosted glass. He watched Earl carry ash from her stove pit and called across the lane that she had built herself a badger hole fit for winter vermin. No one answered him with open laughter then, because the cold had taken breath from banter. But the name Jennings' tomb still traveled where his voice traveled, and children repeated it after supper in kitchens where mothers stirred beans with stiff wrists. In Coldwater, mockery did not require delight. It required only repetition. By the 2nd week of December, Earl had converted the chamber from emergency shelter to full winter system, not because she trusted forecasts, but because she trusted arithmetic. She measured grain in pound lots, marked shelf edges with charcoal lines for projected depletion, and wrote daily entries in a narrow ledger bought for 10 cents from the station agent. Stove fuel consumed, lamp oil consumed, meltwater carried, exterior temperature at dawn and dusk, signs of condensation, and any evidence of rodent ingress. She lined 1 alcove with split willow and hung strips of smoked whitefish from the Ostrobothnia method her mother had used, skin on, high and dry, away from direct heat. She packed turnips in layered sand inside 2 cedar bins and placed onions in netted sacks above them, so rot in one crop did not spread to the other. Under the west shelf, she stored salt in glazed crocks with waxed cloth ties to keep it from clumping in damp weeks. Her grandfather had taught that discipline during winters when sea roads vanished and church bells rang only after storms cleared enough for burial sleds. He had not spoken in parables. He had spoken in counts. 4 months of food became 120 marks in a ledger, each mark requiring place, dryness, and guarded access. He had shown her how to set 2 doors with a dead air interval, how to angle a vent against prevailing wind, how to listen for hollow notes in tamped clay, where water would later intrude. Her mother had added a harder lesson after a winter in which a neighboring family lost 2 sons because pride delayed rationing until stores were already thin. Begin with ration law when shelves are full, not when they are bare. When Earl wrote figures by lamplight in Coldwater, The hand that moved the pencil was young, yet the method belonged to generations that had learned by graveside what delay costs. In late December, church women resumed rounds with broth and mending offers for the sick, but they passed Earl's bank lot by custom that had settled without vote. She had not offended doctrine. She had offended expectation. Widows of 19 were supposed to board with kin, remarry quickly, or at least seek visible company. Earl did none of those things. She bartered for what she could not raise or repair herself, paid cash when possible, and accepted silence as a price for autonomy. A teamster named Joel Harker sold her 3 cracked wagon tarps for 30 cents and asked no questions when she cut them into door flaps and wood stack covers. A rail cook traded 2 pounds of coffee for knitted mittens lined with rabbit fur. A schoolgirl brought worn blanket wool that Earl turned into draft snakes for floor seams, then carried away without stepping into the chamber. Even kindness arrived at arm's length. January 1888 brought alternating thaw and crust freeze, and the North Bank lot proved why previous owners had cursed it. Meltwater from a midday chinook ran down the cut face and pooled near the rear sump, turning clay slick and threatening to wick into stored roots. Earl responded the same afternoon by deepening the gravel pit to 20 inches, laying a shallow fieldstone French drain from rear corner to exterior ditch, and adding a lime wash coat over lower wallstone to suppress mold bloom where moisture lingered. She purchased 1 sack of quicklime from Pemberton for 45 cents and received it with a thin smile from the clerk, who entered her payment on the cash page rather than credit as instructed by his employer. Before dusk, she adjusted the vent stack with a hand-crank damper fashioned from stove scrap and wire, then tested draw by holding a lamp flame at 3 points. The flame leaned steady toward exhaust each time. The walls held. 3 days after that repair, Earl went to the livestock pens south of the rail spur and bought a small bay mare from a freighter reducing his string before spring. The mare was 7 years old, narrow through the chest, sound in the feet, and missing 1 upper incisor. Price was $21 with an old harness included. Earl named her Birch for the pale streak down her face and set a lean-to against the bank with plank siding salvaged from freight pallets. Birch hauled water casks, turned the hand winch Earl rigged for lifting stone, and stood tied at dusk while Earl checked sky color and wind edge. When snow came in, evening bands and the town lamps looked blurred by moving crystal, Earl sometimes rested her forehead against the mare's neck and spoke 1 sentence in a low, level tone. Let them talk. Words do not warm a child. By March, the first winter loosened without calamity, and many in Coldwater treated the season as vindication of their own habits. Rail deliveries had continued often enough. Coal had remained costly but available. The school closed only 6 days total. Men at the barber chair remarked that the widow had buried herself for nothing. Pemberton repeated that phrase often enough for it to become common speech, while his ledgers showed growing balances from households that had bought fuel in panic during cold snaps and paid with spring wages not yet earned. Earl did not answer public talk. She widened her entrance trench, regraded the drainage ditch, and set 6 additional cedar posts along the bank to mark a straight approach in poor visibility. She planted her seed potatoes on a narrow strip upslope, where runoff would not drown them, and fenced the patch against wandering stock with wire scavenged from a broken corral. By early May 1888, when mud swallowed axle hubs on side roads and willow catkins opened along the creek, Earl began a second build phase aimed not at 1 occupant but at sustained capacity. She cut 2 side alcoves from the main chamber, each 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, 1 for dry goods and 1 for fuel reserve sheltered from snowlock. She reinforced the ceiling with 2 additional beams bedded into stone pockets and spread fresh sod over the roof crown to increase thermal mass and reduce summer heat intrusion. She purchased 32 feet of stovepipe at 13 cents per foot, one iron elbow and a spark arrest cap, then reconfigured the flue with a clean-out point that could be reached without moving shelves. At the station auction, she acquired 3 dented kerosene tins for 15 cents each and transformed them into mouse-proof grain boxes by soldering seam cracks shut with scrap lead and resin. June passed warm and deceptively easy, with freight schedules regular and hay forecasts optimistic. Pemberton expanded his front display with imported cloth and enamelware, and he extended credit to 5 new homesteads on the West Rise at interest terms that looked mild in print and severe at harvest. Coldwater read abundance in polished counters and full bins. Earl read different records. She tracked frost dates from nearby claims, marked wind direction shifts at dawn, and noted that meadow voles had begun deeper burrow mounds than the previous year by midsummer. She kept these observations in a second ledger labeled signs, separate from consumption accounts, because her mother had taught that prediction, and stock must never be mixed on the same page if one wished to see error clearly. On September 3, 1888, noon reached 68 degrees under a bright sky, yet shaded ground near the north bank broke hard under Earl's spade 2 inches down, and the exposed clods held a brittle edge more common to late October. That evening, geese crossed low before moonrise in uneven strings, pressing south with urgency rather than drift. Along the creek, she found muskrat banks layered nearly double their usual height, mud packed fresh over old work. At sunrise on the 4th, she rode Birch to town, bought flour at $3 a sack, dried beans in bulk, salt pork at 14 cents per pound, and lamp oil by the gallon, paying cash from a pouch she kept pinned inside her coat. Silas Pemberton watched each purchase entered and remarked loudly that the widow meant to marry dirt and dine like a mole. 2 men laughed because he did. Earl loaded her sled rack without haste, checked each rope knot herself, and led Birch back toward the north bank where the cellar doors waited open for stores that had not yet become scarce. She loaded the sacks and tins into the main chamber before dusk, not in a single heap but by class and failure risk, because flour that touched damp became paste, and lamp oil that chilled in necked bottles could not be poured without wasting wick and patience. 2 flour sacks went to the inner shelf above knee height, 1 went to the rear alcove wrapped in doubled canvas, and the beans she divided into 4 smaller bins, so 1 spoiled seam could not consume a month of meals. She rendered pork scraps that same evening and sealed the fat in stoneware crocks with a finger-thick cap of cooled grease, then marked each lid with charcoal date and weight. Birch stood at the hitch post with feed nosebag on, stamping once at the first edge of night cold, while Earl moved in and out of the dogleg entry, carrying weight that would have required 2 trips later if weather closed in early. By the second week of September, the North Bank site had become less a shelter than a system. Earl cut a 3rd storage recess into the bank, 5 feet deep and 3 feet across, and lined it with split cedar slats raised 2 inches off packed clay to keep sacks from sweating against soil. She rebuilt the stove plinth with an extra brick course and laid a removable iron plate above the firebox to hold a kettle without choking draft. Then ran her hand along every stovepipe seam with a lamp behind it, hunting for pinprick leaks where smoke would escape once wind drove pressure down the flue. At the vent stack, she added a hand-cranked sleeve she had hammered from salvaged tin, with 2 positions scratched into the metal, summer draw and storm draw, and she tied burlap over the intake hood in 3 layers so drift powder would stop in cloth rather than settle inside lungs and grain alike. Nothing in that work was decorative. Every change answered a known failure. She then turned to travel, because stores mattered only if they could be reached when sky and ground vanished into one color. From the hatch, she measured to the Holt cabin, the Reed place, and the church annex, selecting the nearest structures with children, infirm adults, or poor stoves, rather than those with social standing. She sank cedar posts 4 feet deep with a long iron bar, tamped the collars with gravel and clay, and stretched tarred hemp rope between them at chest height, pulling each line tight enough to resist sag under wet snow. At half-fathom intervals, she tied identification knots that could be counted by mittened hands in full whiteout. 2 knots for Holt, 3 for Reed, 4 for Church, then a long, smooth span back toward her own door. She tested each route at night with a cloth over her eyes, one hand on rope, one hand carrying a lantern hooded to a slit, turning deliberately at each knot cluster until muscle learned what sight could not provide. In fair weather, passers-by stopped to watch and exchange glances over the oddity of it. In storm weather, oddity would not be the word they used. On the 16th of September, she brought water discipline underground as well, hauling 8 casks from the pump in repeated mare loads and setting them on plank risers above floor level, each bung waxed and wrapped in oiled cloth. She constructed a melt rack from scrap iron over the stove side, so clean snow could be fed in slowly without dropping chamber heat, by throwing large frozen blocks into open kettles. 2 cast-iron kettles, each 12-quart capacity, were bought from a departing cook for $1.10 together, repaired with peened rivets and seated on brick rings she built herself. She split kindling to forearm length and stacked it by burn rate. Willow first for quick catch, cottonwood second, dense juniper saved for hard cold. On a slate nailed beside the inner door, she wrote a rotation schedule in chalk, though no one else yet shared the room. Stove feed each 2 hours at night, vent check at dawn and noon, water thaw after evening meal, ash pit empty every 3rd day unless wind demanded otherwise. Coldwater noticed all of this and interpreted it as either theater or accusation, and either interpretation produced resentment. Boys from the West Rise came twice to kick at the lower posts and call out that Jennings' tomb had rope reins for ghosts, then fled when Birch pinned her ears and struck the dirt. 2 women at the pump lowered their voices when Earl approached, then resumed normal speech when she left, as if silence itself were a social correction. At church, benches filled around her but not beside her. She was not denied worship, which would have been too open an act, but she was denied the ordinary courtesies through which frontier life admitted one soul into another's routine. Invitations ceased. Shared sewing circles ceased. Even practical conversation narrowed to price and weather, never to trust. Silas Pemberton accelerated what custom had begun. He instructed his clerk in October to refuse Earl any goods on account regardless of collateral, and the refusal was delivered in full hearing near the grain bins where teamsters waited their turn. She asked for 2 sacks of oats to be entered against cash due from mitten orders not yet collected. The clerk looked to Pemberton. Pemberton said that credit rested on community confidence, and community confidence was not strengthened by a widow who preached burial living and public alarm. He then added, with enough volume for the porch rail to hear, that if she preferred to dwell underground, she ought to trade with moles and badgers. The men nearby gave short, uneasy laughs. The clerk returned to scooping meal as if nothing unusual had occurred. Earl paid cash for 1 smaller sack, took her receipt and left without argument. But from that morning onward, she altered her supply chain. She bartered hand-knit mittens lined with rabbit fur, traded smoked fish from her family method for lard and harness leather, and exchanged 2 days of mending for a wagon tongue section she recut into shelf braces. A Norwegian section hand sold her a cracked iron trivet for 15 cents. A widow on the south lane traded onions for a repaired child coat. A rail fireman gave her spent coal clinkers that still held burnable pieces she sorted by lantern after dark. Each exchange bypassed Pemberton's ledger, and by bypassing it, deepened his irritation. He answered by repeating the nickname at every opportunity. Jennings' tomb became his shorthand for folly in unrelated disputes. When a farmer overbought seed, when a drifter spent wages at cards, When a roof leaked because someone trusted cheap shingles, language can harden into policy before anyone names it policy. In cold water that autumn, mockery became an instrument for enforcing sameness. 3 days passed after the first account refusal before Earl addressed town leadership directly. The council met in the back room of the church annex, 7 men and 1 schoolteacher present, with mud on boots and ledger books open for road repairs and rail petitions. Earl brought no petition sheet and no speech-making flourishes. She brought measurements: current flour per household at known purchase rates, probable burn consumption by stove type, average transit interruption from prior storms along that stretch of line, and the observed frost depth from shaded ground in early September. She recommended plainly that Coldwater dig 2 shared trench shelters, stage communal wood stacks under canvas near the church, cap retail prices on staple grain once first heavy snow arrived, and appoint rotating ration clerks before panic buying began. The mayor thanked her for diligence and said, spending authority required demonstrated need. Pemberton, invited as merchant advisor, called her figures imported fear, unsuited to local experience. The council voted to revisit the matter after first real snow. No funds were released. By the first week of October, she had accepted that no central plan would come and adjusted from persuasion to execution. She widened the hatch landing with plank steps pegged into frozen earth, added a windbreak fence on the north side of the entrance, and packed 6 cords of split wood under doubled wagon tarps weighted with stone so gusts could not peel them back. She stitched canvas ration bags in 1-pound and 3-pound sizes and labeled them flour, beans, meal, then stacked them in lidded bins to speed distribution if many hands arrived at once. She carved wooden tags for work duties: water, wood, ash, broth, watch, with holes for twine, so assignments could be hung near the stove and changed without argument. Preparation for one became preparation for many, not by declaration but by geometry. On November the 20th, a warm Chinook swept down the line and drove afternoon temperatures to 45 degrees, softening drifts, loosening roof ice, and filling Main Street with the optimistic noise that follows discomfort not yet understood. Men worked coatless in doorways. Children splashed through thaw ruts. Pemberton set 2 rocking chairs on his porch and said to those gathered that winter had barked once and spent itself, while newcomers who had feared long siege looked almost embarrassed at their own caution. Earl used the warm day to do what warmth allows and cold forbids. She moved both kettles below grade permanently, reset the inner door hinges, retamped 2 post collars where thaw had softened hold, and checked each rope knot for ice glaze that could cut gloves in a gale. At dusk, she stood by Birch's stall with a lantern raised and said in a low voice, as if speaking to a stubborn but faithful witness, that words didn't warm a child, and weather did not bargain. The warning signs arrived in layers after the Chinook passed. Geese that should have lingered another week moved in low, hurried files before moonrise and did not circle feeding flats. Ranch dogs that slept open yard in ordinary cold pressed under porches without prompting and refused to leave at dusk. Smoke from morning stoves, which usually drifted east in a clean band, began dropping flat and hanging near ground until noon, as if the sky itself had lowered. Earl drove an iron rod into shaded soil at 3 points and found new freeze reaching hard where surface mud still suggested autumn. She noted each sign in her ledger and rode to 3 households tied to her rope lines, advising them to bring spare bedding and 1 week of fuel near their doors. 2 thanked her politely and did nothing. 1 nodded, then asked whether she had considered that fear could become a habit, harder to cure than hunger. By November 25th, the town had begun to split between those uneasy enough to prepare quietly and those who treated preparation as insult. The Reeds stacked extra wood by their back wall after sundown so neighbors would not remark on it. The Holts borrowed a second coal scuttle and kept it indoors. Others mocked these acts as surrender to Jennings' tomb thinking. At Pemberton's store, flour price rose again on the claim that incoming wagons had been delayed, though no storm yet blocked road, and buyers paid because refusal carried its own risk. Shelves still appeared full from the doorway, but staple bins had begun to show troughs where scoops reached bottom sooner than expected. Pemberton spoke more loudly than before, a man declaring stability in order to preserve it. On the evening of November the 27th, the westbound telegraph failed first. The station agent tapped the key, listened to static clicks, and sent a boy running with the news that line trouble lay somewhere beyond Elk Cut. 2 hours later, the eastbound wire went silent as well, and Coldwater lost the thin thread that connected rumor to confirmation. No train arrived that night. At dawn on the 28th, Earl checked her barometer nailed beside the hatch door and watched the needle slide lower in a single, steady descent she had seen only before severe sea storms in childhood. She closed the storm sleeve on the vent, filled both kettles, tied Birch in the lee with extra feed, and walked the first rope line once more with mittens off so her bare fingers could feel every knot. Above her, the sky turned iron from horizon to horizon, and the town that had argued so confidently about weather began, at last, to hurry. The hurry came too late for order, and too early for mercy. By mid-morning, the wind struck from the north in hard, sustained blows that lifted old snow from coulees and new snow from cloud base, welding them into one moving wall that erased distance first, then shape, then judgment. The station clock read 10 minutes past 11 when the first true white curtain crossed Main Street, and by noon the temperature had dropped from 14 above zero to 2 above, still falling in a straight, ruthless line. Men who had mocked rope posts now leaned into that rope with both hands just to cross 30 yards of open ground. Teamsters cut traces in abandoned wagons where horses refused the drifts. Doors that opened inward could still be forced. Doors that opened outward froze shut by 2 o'clock. Earl Jennings barred her outer hatch, set the storm sleeve on the vent to its narrow draw, and checked each shelf with the same calm sequence she had practiced in mild weather: flour count, bean count, lamp level, wood stacks by burn class, cask seals, slate duty marks waiting for hands that had not yet arrived. Birch shifted in the lean-to and blew steam into the canvas dark, but the mare had hay, windbreak, and blanket, and Earl had built for exactly this pressure. When she opened the inner door, the chamber air held near 51 degrees. When she cracked the outer door and reached a gloved hand into the passage, the cold bit through wool and skin in less than a minute. Above ground, weather had become a weapon. At the store porch, Silas Pemberton kept his coat collar high and his account book open until paper grew stiff with frost and his clerk could no longer hold ink in the pen. He sold flour by reduced measure before noon and raised the price again by late afternoon, calling it scarcity adjustment, then emergency cost, then simple necessity, as faces at the counter changed from irritated to frightened. By evening of November 28th, lamp oil tins at the front shelves were gone. By dawn on the 29th, coal bins stood half empty and wet from a blowing powder that had found every seam in the siding. Pemberton wrote ration slips no one had agreed to and no one trusted, then locked the side door to keep the line from crowding his scale. Authority in Coldwater had always worn broadcloth and held a ledger. That day, broadcloth shook in the wind, and ledgers could not warm a room. The storm did not break overnight. It thickened. On November the 29th, the noon reading at the station shelter stood at 23 below zero, with gusts estimated above 50 miles per hour by the old rail anemometer before ice seized its cups. Drifts reached window sills on the lee sides of buildings and climbed eaves where crosswinds crossed. Two roof corners peeled from lesser shacks near the spur. Smoke no longer rose in columns. It flattened and drove sideways, then vanished into white motion. At dusk, the church bell rope froze hard where it passed through the belfry slot, and no one climbed to free it. By the second day of December, the town moved not by roads, but by guesswork corridors stamped between structures that remained visible only when wind thinned for seconds at a time. Earl made short line checks between gust fronts, one hand clipped to the hatch post, one hand on rope, counting knots with mittened fingers and clearing ice crust from braided hemp so grip would hold under panic. She found the reed line intact, the Holt line half buried but reachable, and the church line taut with a new drift shoulder that would soon hide the lower knots entirely. She tied rag markers at chest height where she could, then returned below grade before her eyelashes froze together at the edges. In those same hours, Pemberton's store became the image of unraveling. The front shelves still displayed cloth bolts and enamel basins no one needed, while behind the counter the bins for meal and beans dropped to wood. He stopped honoring old credit extensions by the third day and demanded cash, then silver, then trade goods. Any trade goods. Watches, wedding rings, tools, anything that could be marked and stacked, because replacement freight was a fantasy once rail service ceased. When one ranch hand offered a saddle for 2 sacks of flour, Pemberton gave him 1.5. By December 4th, he had armed his clerk with a shovel handle to manage the line. Even then, the line did not shorten. It only bent farther into storm. Coldwater's houses began to fail in quieter, crueler ways than collapse. Firewood stacked in open yards disappeared behind drifts too hard to shovel quickly. Water pails froze beside beds. Stovepipes choked with wind-packed snow where caps were poor. Families burned chair legs, fence rails, broken drawer fronts, then stood in rooms that smelled of wet wool and smoke, listening for any change in the wind that might signal release. There was no release. The weather pressed day after day like an iron lid. On December 6th, Reverend Abel Crowley left the annex before dawn with a rope around his waist and the free end tied to the church rail, insisting to Deacon Miles Harrow that the church register and charity box must be moved before drift sealed the vestry door. He had baptized half the town and buried the rest of their kin. Keeping records seemed to him part of keeping order. Harrow followed 6 paces behind, with a lantern wrapped in cloth, but the gusts took the light and the trail in one sweep. They found Crowley after noon, 30 yards from the annex steps, kneeling against a drifted wall with the register clutched under his coat, his face turned toward the door he had not reached. He died there in silence. Harrow brought the book back wrapped in his own scarf. The ink was dry. The pages were intact. The hands that had carried it were not. 3 days passed before the wind eased enough for any shared burial rite, and even then they could not open ground. Crowley was laid in a temporary snow cairn marked with 2 crossed rails near the lee of the church. No hymn carried in that air. Men bowed their heads and went home to stoves that were losing. On December 9th, Isaac Boone, rail brakeman, broad-shouldered and 31, volunteered for a medicine run after Marta Ellison's fever climbed and her breathing turned shallow. The only laudanum and willow tincture left outside private boxes sat in a locked station chest, and the station stood 200 yards of white confusion from Ellison's rooming house. Boone tied himself to a cargo line and made the outward trip with 2 others, bracing the rope from either end. He reached the station, forced the door, and returned with the satchel against his chest, while the others hauled. Within sight of the rooming house lantern, a gust knocked all 3 to knees and packed snow into Boone's scarf and coat front. They dragged him indoors with the satchel still in his hands. The medicine reached Ellison's bedside. Boone did not survive the night. Marta Ellison had delivered children in Coldwater, stitched knife cuts after freight fights, and once held pressure on a saw wound for 40 minutes while men boiled instruments. She had hands that steadied other souls. By the 11th of December, those hands shook too hard to lift a cup, and she drifted in and out with her ledger open beside her pillow. The names of 2 expected winter births, written in a careful column, she still tried to keep in order between fever waves. Her rooming house landlady kept the ledger dry under folded cloth and waited for the next breath to settle. The dead were now named in every kitchen. Fear changed tone. It was no longer talk of inconvenience, nor quarrel over prices, nor old pride about who had prepared enough. It was arithmetic spoken in whispers. How many sticks remained? How many spoonfuls of meal? How long before lamp oil failed? How far to the nearest door if this one jammed shut? Children were moved from outer beds to inner corners. Men slept in coats. Women rationed broth by cup marks cut into ladles. The storm answered all of it with more wind. Inside Earl's chamber, systems held because she had built for monotony under pressure. She melted snow in measured batches so heat loss stayed predictable. She rotated stored fuel by dryness. She kept one kettle always warm and one always near boil. She wrote temperatures on slate at dawn and midnight, exterior guessed from the rod by the hatch and interior taken from the hanging thermometer that remained stubbornly near 50. Once each day, when gusts gave a brief opening, she checked Birch, rubbed ice from the mare's nostrils, and reset feed. Twice she walked the rope lines and cleared knots with a wooden mallet. She had prepared for one widow winter. She was now maintaining the only stable node within reach of 3 vulnerable households. Late on the 11th of December, as dusk flattened into white dark, a figure appeared at the outer marker post on the reed line, not moving at first, only hanging from the rope with both arms, as if undecided between forward and down. Earl had been at the hatch checking drift height when she saw the coat sleeve whip sideways in a gust. She clipped her belt ring to the main line, took the spare harness strap, and moved out into the passage, and then the open counting knots aloud under her breath to keep direction true. At the second knot cluster, she reached Thomas Reed, 12, his scarf iced to his collar and his left mitten gone. He had tied a cloth over his mouth that had frozen stiff with breath. He tried to speak at once and could not. Earl pressed his mittenless hand under her coat for 10 steps, forced him to grip the rope, and brought him inside the dogleg, where wind dropped from roar to muffled pounding. Only when the inner door closed did she let him talk. Thomas said his mother could not keep the stove lit, that their wood stack was buried beyond reach, that his younger siblings were wrapped in quilts but shivering, that his sister Ruth had started coughing blood into a rag, and that Elias had sent him on the line after failing to force open the store-side door through the drift. He said they had no money left to bargain and no strength left to dig. Earl set a tin cup of hot broth in his hands and waited until he swallowed twice without choking. Then she moved. 2 3-pound flour bags, 1 bean sack, 1 wrapped pork crock, 1 bundle of willow kindling, 1 bundle of dense juniper, 1 lamp refill bottle, 1 spare glove pair, 1 wool blanket roll. She loaded each item to a canvas sled she had kept by the inner wall for exactly this request. She added one of her marked duty tags, wood, and tied it to the reed bundle where any adult could see it by lantern. She gave Tomas the line sequence once, then once again, and made him repeat it while she checked his coat ties and wrapped his bare hand in a strip of blanket wool under the spare glove. He looked toward the stacked shelves as if expecting terms. There were none. She clipped him to the rope with the short harness lead, took the front pull herself, and opened the outer door into the white forest beyond. The rope snapped taut between them as the gust struck, and for a moment Thomas Reed went nearly horizontal behind the sled, his boots skidding over packed drift like loose boards on river ice. Earl lowered her shoulder into the harness and kept the line in her left hand, counting knots by touch because sight had narrowed to a white wall and the dark shape of the next post. At the 3-knot cluster, she turned hard east, found the reed door buried to the latch, and pounded twice with the butt of her mallet. Elias Reed and his mother forced it inward from below drift level, and heatless air spilled out around their faces. There was no speech beyond necessity. Earl pushed in the fuel bundles first, then the food sacks, then set the lamp refill and struck a match herself to ensure the wick took clean flame. Ruth Reed lay under quilts near the stove with a rag at her mouth, not bleeding now, but shaking from cold that had reached too deep for 1 hour of fire to erase. Earl tied the marked wood tag to a nail above the stove and spoke in the stripped cadence of command. 1 pound flour at dawn and 1 at dusk. Beans soaked in warmed water to reduce cook fuel. Smallest children in the inner bed alcove. Stove fed by schedule and not by fear. She left the sequence on their wall in charcoal numbers and made Elias repeat each line until his voice steadied. Then she clipped back to the rope and pulled Tomas toward the hatch. By dawn on December 12th, she had converted the chamber from refuge to station. She cleared the west alcove shelves and set sleeping space for 6 children head to foot, laid a second slate board beside the door for duty rotations, and hung her ration bags where each measure could be seen before it was spent. The next run went to the Holt cabin. Martha Holt met Earl at the line post with her infant son wrapped inside her coat, and Lena walking behind with no hat, her dark hair clotted with frost. Earl put the child inside her own blanket and moved all 3 to the cellar in 2 pulls, because wind between posts had grown violent enough to lift light bodies off balance. Lena gave the wool scarf at her neck to her baby brother in the dogleg passage before Earl could stop her to retie layers. By the time they reached the inner stovelight, Lena's hands were already stiff. Earl and Martha worked her fingers, warmed broth, and wrapped her in heated blankets taken from Earl's own cot. Lena watched her brother drink first, then drifted into exhausted sleep near dawn, while Martha kept tending her by the stove. Before morning, despite continuous warming measures, Lena Holt died. She was 7 years old. 3 days later, the church annex failed as shelter when its stovepipe collar split and packed snow-killed draft. Deacon Harrow came on the 4-knot line with 2 boys and a canvas sack of church candles, and Earl sent him back with rope clips and strict knot counts to guide the rest in pairs. Through December 15th and 16th, she led repeated transfers between gust fronts, always clipped, always counting, bringing in 38 souls by the end of the longest night stretch, with bedding piled against stone and boots lined in ranks by the inner door. The chamber was 12 by 16, not generous, yet earth held temperature where plank walls could not. Wealthier homes with 2 parlors and imported rugs stood colder than her bankroom by 20 degrees. Pemberton's store had sold cloth at premium and grain on interest, but cloth did not burn, and paper credit did not boil beans. Inside the cellar, value reduced to heat, water, and measured food. On December 18th, with exterior readings near 36 below and wind still above 50, Silas Pemberton came down the church line on hands and knees, coat torn at one elbow, fingers wrapped in gray rags where skin had blackened. He carried no ledger, no keys, no authority except the will to keep breathing. Earl opened the outer door, brought him in, checked his hands, and set him by the stove edge with no ceremony. When he could stand, she put a wooden duty tag in his palm. Wood. He fed the fire by schedule through that night and the next, shoulder to shoulder with ranch hands whose debts he had once called in at harvest. No one argued the assignment. The cellar had one law. Each able body worked. By the second week of January 1889, routine had replaced panic. Earl demonstrated vent management, showing how storm draw narrowed to preserve heat, and how stale air signs appeared first in lamp flame and then in children's coughs. On slate, she showed ration accounting, converting sacks to days at fixed portions, so rumor could not outrun arithmetic. Adults practiced rope travel with mittens on and lantern hooded, each walking the first 10 knots blindfolded in the passage, until hands learned what eyes would lose. She did not lecture about being right. She taught because failure to teach would bury them all in the same season. Thomas Reed became line runner for lighter loads. Martha Holt took broth rotation after Lena's burial in a marked snow trench near the church lee, where Deacon Harrow carved her name on a cedar board with a pocket knife heated in stove coals so it would not split. The storm loosened in late February, then returned in short assaults, then finally weakened enough in March for drifts to crust and settle. On March 24, 1889, the first wagon from the south reached Coldwater with broken trace chains and 2 dead mules, and by March 29th the town could count. Coldwater had 271 souls living. 41 were dead across town and outlying claims. Every surviving household could now recite measurements once mocked. 12 by 16 chamber, double doors with 18 inches dead air, ropes at half-fathom knots, posts sunk 4 feet, 6 cords covered before first lock storm. The phrase Jennings' tomb still existed, but no one spoke it with laughter. The reckoning began not in one dramatic evening, but in recorded testimony before spring planting, held in the church annex after repairs, with the register that Abel Crowley died to protect laid open on the table. Families came in work clothes with mud still on boots from thaw ditches. Deacon Harrow read names of the dead first, including Crowley, Isaac Boone, and Lena Holt, and required a silence long enough to feel, not perform. Then he called those who had held authority before the storm to speak what they had done and what had failed. Silas Pemberton stood with both hands bandaged and spoke for longer than any sermon that winter. He stated that he had called the cellar Jennings' tomb in public and in trade rooms. He stated that he had raised prices from fear and habit when supply thinned. He stated that his shelves, his credit, and his claims of control had failed within 9 days of rail interruption. He did not ask to be excused by weather. He asked that his words be entered exactly, and they were entered exactly. He then signed a transfer of lumber stock at cost to district crews building earth-sheltered stores on Earl's plan, with no interest added and transport included from his remaining team. Others followed in shorter voices. Elias Reed admitted he had postponed fuel stacking because public ridicule had made caution feel like weakness. Martha Holt spoke Lena's name without weeping and said she had once crossed the street to avoid Earl's greeting, and that the memory would remain with her longer than frost scars. The schoolteacher Naomi Pike asked that autumn lessons be altered so frost signs, ration math, and rope travel were taught before copybook drills each year. No one clapped. No one sought relief in spectacle. They signed labor days instead, stone hauling, ditch cutting, roof packing, and winter ledger keeping by district. When Earl was asked to speak, she remained standing beside the stove where she had spent nights measuring wood to the hour, and she answered with a steadiness the room had come to trust. She said that grief for Abel Crowley, Isaac Boone, and Lena Holt could not be settled by phrases spoken in warm rooms. She said she would not offer quick forgiveness because the dead required better than quick words. She said she had not built to win arguments, and she had not opened her door to collect apologies. She had built because earth remembers cold longer than pride remembers warning, and because children require heat whether adults are courteous or cruel. If the town wanted a response, her response was instruction and obligation. Any household that wished to learn would learn. Any district that built would keep written winter ledgers open for inspection. Shared reserves would be issued first to widows, children, hired hands, and the sick before merchants balanced accounts or landholders secured stock feed. She would teach methods freely. Whether anyone called that forgiveness was their own burden to name. Work began within 48 hours. By April 2nd, teams were cutting sod blocks along 3 banks under Earl's measurements, and by mid-May the first communal cellar frame stood near the church with double doors and vent baffle, copied from her drawings in chalk and string. Through summer, she walked each site with a measuring rod and corrected errors without insult. Deeper post collars, tighter gaskets, drain slope adjusted 1 inch over 8 feet. Pemberton supplied nails and hinges at cost as pledged, and took wood duty at every public build day until his hands healed. The phrase "building like Jennings" entered trade talk by harvest, not as mockery now, but as a standard for work expected to hold. Years passed, and the method became institution. By October 1898, Coldwater maintained 6 communal cellars, each with posted ration law and duty tags by the inner doors. School children learned to read geese flight, muskrat bank height, and early frost depth before arithmetic tables each autumn term, then practiced blind knot counts on a training line behind the schoolhouse. Winter ledgers were copied in duplicate, one kept by district stewards and one stored in the church register chest beneath Crowley's restored entries. Earl remained on the North Bank lot, expanded but still recognizable, with birch buried upslope under a stone marker after the mare died in her 19th year. The original hatch lintel still bore a cedar board, cut by Deacon Harrow, and finished by Naomi Pike's older students, letters deep and plain so drifting ice would not erase them. Build low, share early, and outlast the wind together. In hard seasons, the town repeated that line before first snow council, and in mild seasons they repeated it anyway, because prosperity had once taught them carelessness, and they had paid in named graves. The cellar still stood, the ledgers still filled, and Coldwater measured wisdom thereafter, not by who laughed loudest in fair weather, but by who had prepared enough to keep another soul alive when weather turned. The words settled in the annex with the weight of timber set true, and no one moved for several breaths after Deacon Harrow finished speaking them aloud. Earl stood near the stove with her gloves tucked in her belt, watching Naomi Pike hand out fresh winter ledgers, cut from station paper and stitched with thread saved from flour sacks. Each book cost 4 cents in paper and binding, and each household paid the cost in coin or labor marks before taking one home. There would be no loose promises this year, and no memory left to chance. Silas Pemberton crossed the room last. His bandaged hands had healed into stiff, shiny skin, and he carried a narrow cedar box under one arm, plain, smooth, and fitted with a latch he had made himself. He set it on the table beside Reverend Crowley's restored register and opened it without speech. Inside lay 3 items wrapped in linen. Earl's first supply receipts from 1887 that his clerk had kept in a side drawer, the signed transfer sheets for lumber sold at cost after the storm, and a folded slip in his own hand with the words "Jennings' Tomb" written once, then crossed out with ink so heavy it had nearly torn the paper. He said, in a voice stripped of his former porch authority, that these papers had belonged in public record, not private shame. He asked Deacon Harrow to place them in the church chest beside the winter ledgers, so later stewards would see what arrogance cost and what correction required. Then he turned toward Earl, not asking pardon, not seeking comfort, and told her plainly that he had profited from fear until fear turned on him. He said he had expected her to remind him of it forever. She had not. That silence had instructed him more than any sermon. Earl answered in the same measured tone with which she had once assigned wood duty in a crowded cellar. She said that memory had value only if attached to task. If he meant what he had spoken, he would keep hinge stock aside every August at fixed price for cellar doors. No exception for market swings. He nodded once and said he had already written that policy into his ledger margin, signed and witnessed by Naomi Pike and Elias Reed at dawn that morning. Deacon Harrow took the cedar box, read each document heading aloud, and entered all three into the church record by date. 3 days later, on October 9th, 1899, the first district training began behind the schoolhouse under a thin sky that held no threat yet and therefore demanded discipline. Earl set the practice rope between cedar posts and had every household send one able body, not always fathers, not always men. Martha Holt came with her infant son now walking at her skirt. Thomas Reed came as line marshal, taller than Earl by then, still careful with knots. Silas came as well, carrying 2 spare coils and a bucket of lamp black to mark knot clusters for new learners. The drill looked simple in sunlight and proved difficult by the third turn. Earl tied cloth over each trainee's eyes and made them walk from hatch marker to annex marker by touch alone, counting half-fathom knots in a low voice while Naomi timed them with a pocket watch. Any missed knot meant beginning again from post 1. Any panic grip meant stopping, breathing, and restarting. No one was mocked. No one was excused. By the second week of October, every district had 2 certified line guides and 1 reserve, names posted in the church vestibule beside fuel inventories and infirm lists. That same month, Earl finally planted the last of the seed potatoes she had brought in her wooden box 12 years earlier, preserving each season's strongest eyes in sand and replanting by strict selection. The final hill went into a raised plot above the north bank where runoff could not drown it, and children from Pike's class watched her cut and set each piece with ash dust on the wound to prevent rot. She told them that food security began with ordinary things done on schedule, not heroic acts in emergencies. Thomas recorded the yield weight at harvest, 176 pounds from that line, and entered it into District 1's reserve book under the heading, Jennings Seed Stock Completed. The telegraph line that had failed west and east in November 1888 had been rebuilt with deeper poles and iron braces by spring 1889. Yet, Earl never treated wire service as certainty. Each first week of November, after line inspection reports arrived at the station, she required district stewards to conduct 1 full day as if the wires were dead. No external requests, no freight expectation, no deferred planning. In 1901, the station agent protested that the drill insulted railroad reliability. Naomi Pike asked him to read the 1888 entries in Crowley's register before objecting again. He read them. The protest did not return. By January 1903, when a shorter but violent whiteout struck with lows near 28 below, cold water did not descend into bargain panic. Families moved by posted protocol. Lamp allotments held. Communal cellars opened in rotating order, and rations were weighed on standard scales purchased jointly at $7.60. One outlying homestead arrived late with smoke damage and near-empty stores, and they were admitted at once under the Widows and Children First Clause Earl had written years earlier. There were injuries that winter, frostbitten fingers and 1 broken ankle on an ice threshold, but no preventable starvation deaths inside town limits. The walls held again, now in 6 places. The fuller reckoning came not in a single assembly, but in a pattern that repeated every autumn for years, each admission smaller than the last, and therefore, in some ways, harder. Men who had once laughed at rope posts asked Earl to inspect their post collars and listened when she told them to dig deeper by 6 inches. Women who had turned away at the pump brought her ledger pages to review and accepted corrections in neat red pencil. The children who had chanted Jennings' tomb grew into adults who used a different phrase at lumber orders and council bids. Build it Jennings tight. It entered contracts, marriage agreements on new claims, and school copy lines in Naomi Pike's classroom. In March 1912, Deacon Harrow died at 73 after a brief fever, and his final instruction was practical to the end. He asked that the cedar lintel over Earl's original hatch be recut before rot took the lower edge, and that the carved line be transferred exactly. Silas paid for the cedar beam. Thomas and 2 apprentices set it in place. Earl watched from the bank in a heavy coat, said nothing during the work, then ran her gloved hand once over the letters after the men stepped down. Earl Jennings lived long enough to see a second generation carry winter discipline without her direct orders. On February 6, 1937, with temperature at 9 below and snow moving lightly from the northwest, she died in her chair inside the expanded North Bank cellar, 68 years old, a ledger open on her lap to the page marked Fuel Remaining District 3. Naomi Pike, gray-haired and still precise, closed the book and read the final line she had written that morning. Enough, if shared early. They buried Earl on the slope above Birch's Stone with Reverend Crowley's restored register opened again, this time by his successor, and with no grand speeches beyond names, dates, and obligations. Silas had died 3 years before, but his store policy pages remained in force under new ownership. Thomas Reed, now winter steward, read the ration law aloud after the burial and assigned posts for the next storm cycle before dusk. The original chamber still stands in Coldwater. The double door gap remains 18 inches. The knot training line behind the school is renewed every 3rd autumn. Children still learn frost depth before arithmetic in October. The church chest still holds Crowley's register, Pemberton's crossed-out slip, and the first supply receipts of a 19-year-old widow who trusted earth over ridicule. When First Snow Council opens each year, the lintel words are spoken without ceremony because ceremony is no longer needed. Build low, share early, and outlast the wind together.